morning. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my privilege this evening to welcome you and to introduce the Right Honorable David Trimble, leader of the Ulster Unionist Party and First Minister of the Northern Ireland Assembly. He's also co-recipient of the 1998 Nobel Peace Prize for his role in bringing about the historic Good Friday agreements. The Nobel Committee praised Mr. Trimble's great political courage. His courage is marked by his embrace of a pragmatic resolution to Northern Ireland's troubles and by his ceaseless efforts to persuade skeptical unionist factions to do the same. He's reached across the chasm dividing Protestant and Catholic to seek peace with longtime adversaries. As we know, bringing peace among foes is never easy, but the commitment of leaders like David Trimble to negotiated settlement gives us hope that the current setbacks will be temporary. In brief, his career started with a law degree at Queen's University in 1968, where he graduated first in his class. He then, in 1977, joined the Ulster Unionist Party and also became a member of the law faculty at Queen's University. In 1990, he was elected MP for Upper Bann, and in 1995, he was elected leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. In 1998, David Trimble was elected First Minister Designate of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and in December 1999 was confirmed as First Minister. We look forward to hearing tonight his views of what is happening in Ulster, and please join me in welcoming David Trimble.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for the introduction, and thank you all too for coming and displaying so obviously by your presence and interest in the situation that we're dealing with. What I thought actually I'd do this evening, and it may not be just precisely what you might have expected, and if consequently there are issues and matters which I don't address in the remarks that follow, then we'll have plenty of opportunity in questions afterwards to pick those matters up. But what I thought I'd like to do is to step back from the immediate situation that we're dealing with, to step back from the procedures of the last week, 2 weeks, even indeed the last month or two, and to take a bit of a view of the situation in Northern Ireland generally, and to pose and to try and answer, and obviously only answer them from my own particular perspective, but to pose the question, why did the Troubles begin, and why are they now ending? You know, how did we get into this situation? How is it that we're now coming out of it? And if there's one sort of theme that, or point that I want to come back to again and again in this, and it's something that came to mind this morning when I was giving a talk at another place, which I'll not mention, and they asked me to take part in a symposium with two distinguished historians dealing with the situation in Northern Ireland, and they asked me to address the question of the future of unionism. Somebody else was dealing with the history and the other person the present, and I was asked to address the future. And of course, I had to put in a caveat right at the beginning, and it's something which I think is quite important. I think we cannot tell, none of us can tell, what the future is. Nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody can predict it either. Because while there might be significant forces, while there might be significant trends, you could see time and time again in human circumstances the operation of chance factors, of accident, of things that are attributable to a particular time and a place and a particular individuals. And I think you'll see that happening. It is my view that that happens very much in terms we look back over what happened in Northern Ireland. Before I come to the question of why did it start, we have to address the question of what actually is it, what are we dealing with in terms, what is the issue that is there? And the issue that exists in Northern Ireland, although it is described in terms that partake of religion, although it's talked about in terms of a conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, those terms deceive more than they illuminate. The essence of the issue in Northern Ireland is a clash of different national identities and different national allegiances. It's a clash between people who view themselves as belonging to a separate Irish nation and people who view themselves as being part of British society and consequently part of the United Kingdom. It's a question of to which state shall this piece of territory belong, the piece of territory being Northern Ireland, the states being the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. It's a situation which is familiar to us from a dozen of different places, more than a dozen places throughout Europe, where you find similar situations where a piece of territory is contested between two states and that territory does not have a homogeneous population. We have that problem. It's also a situation that came into existence because of the failure of nation building in the British Isles. The history of the British Isles over the course of the last, hundreds of years has been a question of the building of a integrated society, integrated socially, economically and politically in the British Isles, and the creation of a single state within the British Isles. But that nation-building exercise did not succeed with regard to the south and west of Ireland. And there then developed in the south and west of Ireland in the 19th century a separate national identity. And it developed then in recognisably modern terms. And the growth of nationalism in the 19th century in Ireland can be paralleled with the growth of nationalism in many countries in Central and Eastern Europe. The parallel goes further. The creation of the Irish Free State in the 1921-22 can be paralleled with the creation of other states in Central and Eastern Europe. The Irish Free State is as much a child of Versailles as is Czechoslovakia and other states, because it was founded on exactly the same principle of self-determination. And the parallels are there too. It was obviously necessary in 1921-22 to divide Ireland, because there existed within the island of Ireland people with two different national allegiances, and there was a geographic basis to that difference. The division, of course, was not neat. It left minorities north and south. It left a minority of 320,000 people who regarded themselves as British in the Irish Free State, and a minority of 420,000 people who regarded themselves as Irish, still within Northern Ireland, still within the United Kingdom. So we had a division that was not neat. And while there can be arguments about the way in which it proceeded and a particular way in which the line was drawn, nonetheless, the division in the island flowed from the different national identities that were there. I'm not going to deal with the period between the two world wars. They were not a happy time. The economic depression post-war led into the Great Depression, and it can't be said that society developed in any significant way in Northern Ireland during the period. And I'm not going to pursue also the question of the experience of the Irish Free State and of the minority in it. I'm going to deal just simply with the position in Northern Ireland. The Second World War and the interwar years, however, were a different matter. There was a very significant opportunity for society in Northern Ireland after the Second World War. A number of reasons for this. First of all, the experience of the war itself. The Blitz, particularly in Belfast. Belfast suffered quite heavily from German bombing during the war. One particular, the bad raid, there was 950 casualties, fatalities, not casualties, fatalities in one night. It was the highest death toll in one night in any British city outside London. People quite often think of Coventry as being the city that suffered the most in any single raid outside of London. Not so, it was Belfast. And that affected everybody in Belfast. And there was the common experience of people in working class areas of Belfast who in previous years and generations would have been each other's throats, found themselves in exactly the same air raid shelters, suffering from the same danger. There was a shared experience there. There was also greater confidence in terms of the Unionist administration in Northern Ireland at that time. The interwar years had been difficult. They suffered from a lot of insecurity because there was a fair amount of criticism coming from London as to the operation of the Unionist administration there. In the post-war period, that was different. Because of Northern Ireland's contribution to the British war effort, indeed the Allied war effort, compared to the neutrality of the Irish Free State, there was a greater recognition of the value of Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom, which made the Unionist administration more secure. There was also the benefits that were coming through to society in Northern Ireland of the welfare state. Welfare state becomes introduced in the late 40s. It's the creation, of course, of the Labour government in London, but it's applied automatically in Northern Ireland. And that actually transforms the situation for many people in Northern Ireland, in that the threat of poverty and disease, which had been present beforehand, becomes something that is not then a serious problem. Nationalists continue with the nationalist rhetoric, but there's plenty of examples of nationalists in the period, in the 40s and 50s, talking about the benefits of the welfare state, and the benefits to them and to the nationalist community of it are widely experienced. There is, of course, still the social division, there is still the political problem in Northern Ireland. But by the late 50s, certainly, you see a shift, or at least an approach beginning to come in terms of the approach of the Unionist administration. It can be summed up in the terms of an attempt at modernisation. And there was a significant effort being made by the Unionist administration in the 50s and 60s to modernise. That came in physical terms, it came in economic terms as well. Measures are taken to introduce modern concepts of planning into the economy and into physical development. Redevelopment, urban redevelopment, begins for the first time. Wasn't entirely a matter of neglect beforehand. The great period of building in Belfast had been in the second half of the 19th century, and it was then consequently from the 1950s on that those properties became obsolete and redevelopment became appropriate. But redevelopment starts, slum clearance as it was called, starts in Belfast at that time. Efforts to attract industry become particularly successful. We find in the 1960s unemployment in Northern Ireland coming down to historic low levels, and it was a period of considerable confidence within the community. I was born in 1944. Obviously, for me, the late 50s, early 60s, the period of, period I grew up in, and the optimism of youth was certainly reinforced by what was happening in society at the same time. There was a recognition, too, by government of the need to make changes politically. I think that needs to be borne in mind. In terms of how Northern Ireland was administered, most of the problems came actually with local government, not Stormont. And there were problems about the abuse of power, but they are actually at a local level rather than at the regional level. And there was in the administration a realisation of the need to change local government. And although it wasn't stated, and this is clearly unfortunate, though it wasn't stated clearly, there was a recognition of the need to move away from the ratepayer franchise in local government. That had existed in the United Kingdom generally until 1948, and in 1948 England moved from a ratepayer franchise to a universal franchise in local government. It was clearly desirable to do the same in Northern Ireland. There was, I think, a realisation of that, and I think the need for change was signalled, but because of political embarrassments it was not being addressed with the urgency that it needed. In political terms also, there was a recognition of the need to improve community relations, and this was the particular contribution that Terence O'Neill, who became Prime Minister in the early 1960s, developed with his concept of civic weeks and other matters to improve civic relations. The point I'm making is that within unionism there was clearly a desire to modernise, and there was a response to that within the nationalist community. The traditional Nationalist Party accepted a recognition of its position as the official opposition within Stormont, but more significantly there were other elements within nationalism who were operating through new parties such as the New Democratic Party, whose focus was not on an old-fashioned nationalist agenda, but on a reformist agenda and on the opportunity of involvement and inclusion within Northern Ireland. This may have been a bit long-winded in terms of an introduction, but it leads to this proposition that with a little bit more vigour, and a little bit more drive, particularly from the Unionist administration, modernisation of Ulster society in the 1960s could have worked. We could have seen that modernisation occur. We could have seen society becoming more integrated politically as it was being more integrated socially and economically, and we could have completely avoided the troubles that broke on us from the late 60s onwards. Now, the conventional explanation as to why modernisation was not pursued with particular vigour that is given in the books is usually with regard to difficulties within unionism, and particularly the activities of what are called extremists, particularly identified with Ian Paisley. But that conventional explanation, I doubt. It's usually the explanation is advanced with regard to the meetings that Terence O'Neill, the then Unionist Prime Minister, had with Lemass, the Irish Prime Minister, in 1965. But there was a Stormont election in 1965, and O'Neill won it with a record number of seats. Paisley was unable to muster any significant support. There was grumbling in the party, but it didn't go beyond that. There was one occasion when Lemass, the Irish Prime Minister, came up to Stormont, and all Ian Paisley could do with a handful of people around him as they stood there in the snow and watched Le Mas speed past, was to make a few snowballs and throw them at the car as it went past. There was no significant support at that stage for Paisleism. Well, what went wrong? 3 reasons why things went wrong at this stage. The first I've already mentioned, the absence of vigorous leadership within unionism. And this is a criticism that I must say starts with Terence O'Neill, but goes beyond Terence O'Neill to other leading figures in the party. There was a failure to move forward vigorously enough, and there were problems at the leadership level. There were divisions, there were personality factors as well. But we have to say, looking back on it, that with better quality of leadership, things could have been very different. So that's one factor. Second factor as to why things went wrong is the year after the Le Mas meeting that I mentioned, 1966. 1966, 50th anniversary of the rebellion in Dublin, celebrated by Irish nationalists in unambiguous terms. There was a huge demonstration, obviously in Dublin, but also in Belfast. There was a large Republican demonstration on Easter Sunday in 1966. And for that, Paisley organised a demonstration, I would call it a counter-demonstration, but it was physically quite separate from it, in Belfast. He attracted a crowd of 5,000. It was the first time Paisley had ever had significant mass support. So the rising of the temperature in terms of republicanism evoked a similar rise in other terms, in terms of militant unionism. There's another factor too. The television service of the Irish Republic, Radio Telefís Éireann, made a film about 1916. It made it in terms that was unambiguously celebrating the rebellion and the success of the rebellion and all the rest of it. It was simply a celebration. And every Catholic school child in Northern Ireland was taken to see that film. The film was an unabashed appeal to romantic nationalism. And it meant that in 1966 there was a massive injection of romantic nationalist feeling into the Catholic community in Northern Ireland, particularly into the younger ones. And then that links in with what happened in the late 60s, particularly in 1968, the international ferment that existed associated with students in many places, the developments in Paris in May of 1968, all of that created a ferment and tied up with other factors. And that also helped to take things the wrong way. Even then, violence was not inevitable. There were demonstrations in 1968, and under pressure from London, O'Neill introduced a reform package which was generally accepted. It took the events of 1969 to turn things towards violence. And those happened partly at first with the deliberately provocative march of a group calling itself People's Democracy. And you may note the sort of Marxist terminology of that. In January 1969, culminating, of course, in the developments, the riots that took place in Londonderry and then in Belfast in August of 1969. Note that before that, several weeks before the events in August 1969, anticipating difficulties, knowing that the quite small police force was not equipped and trained for dealing with civic disorder, the Unionist administration approached the London government and asked for help to deal with any civil disorder, and the help was refused. The government in London said to Stormont, you're on your own, you deal with it, we will not give you help unless you cannot cope. So in effect, London was saying, it's only after things get out of control that we will offer assistance. And that actually was a serious mistake. The result was that on the 15th of August, with the police force concentrated in Londonderry, when appeals went out for nationalist demonstrations in Belfast to take the pressure off Londonderry, with a depleted police force there, the police lost control of the situation, and we had serious rioting. The army comes in late, but the army comes in late, not fully briefed on the situation, and in one particularly tragic incident, the army sent to the Springfield Road, not familiar with the geography, not familiar with the rows of streets, goes and sets up its posts and its line in completely the wrong place, meaning that the mobs were left with facing each other with no security force personnel in the vicinity of Bombay Street, and we all know the outcome of that. Only that brings about a situation where the provisional IRA war started. There was a reason why we got into that situation. There's partly the background in it, but there were opportunities to avoid it which were not taken, and there were mistakes that were made clearly in that. That's how I think the Troubles in Northern Ireland started. But once those Troubles started, whatever the background might have been in terms of abuses and possible reforms, it became a struggle about partition. It became a struggle about the national issue. I'm not going to go through that struggle in detail. I want to come forward now to looking at the question of why then, when it started, is it now, so many years later, coming to an end? There are a number of reasons why it's coming to an end. One of the first ones, and actually the most important one, or not necessarily the most important, but a very important one, is that the campaign launched by the Provisional IRA for the purpose of ending partition failed. Simple as that. It did fail. And that actually should have been fairly clear early on. Jack Holland from West Belfast, who's an informed commentator about this, published a book recently which is Hope Against History, I think is the title of it. He refers to the thinking of the Provisional IRA leadership in 1970, 1971. He says that they had looked at the example and the experience of the British Army in Aden and noticed that after a certain number of servicemen, I think it was 37, had been killed, the British withdrew from Aden. And so they made the very simplistic calculation, if we kill that number of British soldiers in Belfast, they'll withdraw from Belfast too, as they did from Aden. And that simply didn't happen. It might have looked to Republicans as though it was going to happen in 1972, because in 1972, the London government prorogued Stormont, abolished the Stormont Parliament, and made overtures to Republicans, leading to a Republican ceasefire in the summer of 1972. And within a matter of days of that ceasefire, an IRA delegation, not a Sinn Féin delegation, an IRA delegation, was invited to London to talks with the Secretary of State. So on that occasion, within a week of the ceasefire, the IRA leadership was sitting in Chain Walk by the Thames, speaking to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Interesting, the composition of that delegation. At that time, the leadership of the Republican movement was essentially southern-based, Dublin-based, and that Dublin-based leadership decided that they needed to have the two most prominent activists in Northern Ireland included in the delegation, and so Mr. Martin McGuinness and Mr. Gerard Adams were added to the delegation. So Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams had their first experience being part of a delegation which in 1972 spoke on behalf of the IRA to Willie Whitelaw, the Secretary of State. And the discussions broke down. The very first discussion broke down. And the Secretary of State concluded that there wasn't any prospect of anything being done politically then. So while it might have looked to Republicans as though the campaign was succeeding, in fact, even in 1972, you have government realizing that there isn't any way out, any deal that can be done with Republicans. It has to be a matter of battening the hatches down and seeing the matter through. One significant thing about the years of the Troubles, which Unionists in Northern Ireland regularly forget, because one of the difficulties we have with the present situation is that there's a fairly low level of confidence amongst Unionists in the intentions and the objectives of the British government, and sometimes with good reason. But one of the things they forget is that on the fundamental issue, on the fundamental democratic issue of upholding the wishes of the people of Northern Ireland to be part of the United Kingdom, there has actually been no softening on that point by a British government over the years. There has not, in fact, been, over those years, any significant political movement in the rest of the United Kingdom to pull out of Northern Ireland. There's been no movement for withdrawal. Oh yes, you can get people in an opinion poll, if you ask them, would you like to see the army out of Northern Ireland? They say yes. If you ask them in an opinion poll saying, would you like to see the problem go away? They'd say yes. But that's not the same thing as actually having a serious political campaign, nor has there been one. That's not to say that there haven't been times when British governments thought or looked at options. Indeed, in the mid-1970s, Harold Wilson, then Prime Minister, set up a three-man study team at Downing Street and told them to go and consider the options and to think the unthinkable. One of the unthinkable things they thought about was trying to bring about a united Ireland. And rumours of these thoughts percolated abroad. And indeed, the Irish government became aware that there were people in Downing Street who were thinking about this. The reaction of the Irish government on this point in 1975 was most instructive. They immediately got in touch with the White House and urged the then American president to go and speak to the British and urge them to stay in Northern Ireland at all costs and not to withdraw. The Irish government was horrified at the thought of being presented with Northern Ireland and didn't want it. So there was no serious move in that respect. A similar exercise, I should say, occurred under Thatcher. She too had a number of people looking at the question of thinking the unthinkable. And they came to the conclusion that there was no alternative to the present arrangements. United Ireland wasn't the only one they looked at. They also looked seriously at the question of independence, and there was a bit of an effort by Northern Ireland officials at that time to interest loyalist paramilitaries in the concept of independence, and with some success, but there was no significant market for that idea within Northern Ireland. So the main reason why the campaign failed was it could not bring about a British withdrawal. Moreover, when Republicans shifted their tactics to that of the long war and a war of attrition, they then found that the attrition was actually cutting against them. And the claims made by certainly the Chief Constable of the RUC in the 80s and early 90s that they were frustrating 4 out of 5 terrorist operations mounted by Republicans were true. And you can see that illustrated in a couple of accounts of the situation then. I'm thinking here particularly of the account based on the diaries of a senior police officer by the name of Phoenix, who was killed in the helicopter crash in the Mull of Kintyre. Jack Holland contributed to the writing of that book, and in that book it brings out clearly the extent to which RUC Special Branch was being effective. And then if you compare the Phoenix book with the first set of memoirs from Martin McGartland, the IRA defector, who at that stage, while still a member of the IRA, was supplying information to the authorities, it's most instructive. McGartland describes clearly the problems that existed within the IRA in terms of mounting operations. The two books are interesting to look at together because in one case at least, they both describe exactly the same operation from different sides. And you can see that the accounts matching, but not just in that operation, but also in terms of their description of the circumstances at the time. IRA activity was declining steadily through the 80s, and from about the mid-80s on, the number of fatalities that IRA activity was responsible for was between 30 and 50 per annum, and closer many times to the lower figure rather than the higher one. It is true that at the end of the 1980s, violence is increasing, but it's increasing because the way in which the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985 destabilizes loyalist paramilitarism, and you have a rise of violence on the loyalist side to such a point that in the early 1990s, loyalists are responsible for more murders than the IRA are. That's the period just immediately before the ceasefire. Even then, it has to be said that the RUC attrition rate against loyalists was also particularly effective, and in time would have been also effective in terms of curbing that activity. So the campaign failed in achieving its objectives, and the attrition from the security forces pointed to that campaign gradually running down. We do not know for how long it could have been sustained, and we do not know what difficulties and problems there still would have been. But the Republicans came to the ceasefires not from positions of strength in terms of paramilitarism, but from positions of comparative weakness. There are other factors at work too, other than those that relate purely to the security issues, and the other major factor is the changes that took place in Irish nationalism. Now here, one of the most significant contributions is the contribution of John Hume. And John Hume was massive in the impact he had on Irish nationalist thinking, and in changing it away from thinking that was rooted in territory, rooted in a land, and moving it to the concept of people, that instead of addressing a divided land, that nationalists should think in terms of addressing a divided people and of seeking a way forward through agreement. Although John didn't subscribe publicly to what we would call the consent principle, it was implicit in his approach, that by moving from land to people and seeking progress through agreement, he was implicitly accepting the consent principle, and that actually shifted nationalist thinking, or the thinking of many nationalists, into territory where there was the prospect of a useful and fruitful dialogue with unionists. while nationalism stayed on an old-fashioned approach that they were going to unite the territory irrespective of the views of the people, there was nothing much that we could talk about. If instead we were talking about entering into an agreement about how people who were divided on some issues could nonetheless cooperate together, that was a totally different situation indeed. So the change in thinking that we find in terms of nationalism that John Hume brings about is massively important in this. At the same time, too, and of similar nature, changes were taking place in terms of society in the Republic of Ireland. And here you have a whole series of events from the original free trade agreement with the United Kingdom through entry into the European Union and so on. You've also got the changes taking place within the Catholic Church after Vatican II. The sum total of it is that when you come to the 1980s and 1990s, the Republic of Ireland is quite a different society to that which existed right up until the 70s. Different socially, different in its outlook too. People were no longer attached to old-fashioned territorial nationalism, were indeed more than a little embarrassed by the terrorist campaign that was allegedly being waged in their name, preferred to think of themselves as modern Europeans and wanted to be involved in the modern world in that way. There was a significant change there too as well. The world itself changed, and this again is part of that background. We had at the beginning of the last decade the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism. That is an important background to the development of the peace process. It's an important background partly in that it deprived militant republicanism of a resource. Most of the material that militant Irish republicanism has had over the course of the last decade, the Semtex, the AK-47s, they come immediately from Libya, but their original point of origin is, of course, behind the Iron Curtain. And so the communist bloc was indirectly a significant resource for the IRA, and of course that's not available in the same way after the fall of the wall. But the fall of the wall is more important in general terms. The fall of the wall is the triumph of democracy, and it happens in a world where terrorism and Marxist activism is no longer fashionable, no longer popular. It's a different world to that of the 1970s, when the Red Army faction and the Red Brigades were active in Germany and Italy, and there was ferment elsewhere. The fall of the wall marks a different world. And of course, Western Europe itself has also changed. The growth of the European Union is often referred to as the factor behind this change and change of outlook. It is part of a general shift away from old-fashioned nationalism to a different, more liberal, more pluralistic view in terms of nationalism. I myself doubt actually sometimes whether the growth of the institutions of the European Union are that important. I rather suspect that mass tourism within Europe probably did as much as anything else to broaden the horizons of people and make them more receptive to other cultures and other ways of doing things. But certainly we find a change taking place. Unionism is not immune from change, and wasn't immune from change in that situation too. It had rethought the matter, and many unionists, while many unionists look back with nostalgia to the days before 1972, others realized that change was necessary, and it was necessary to find an accommodation with the people with whom we shared Northern Ireland. The Anglo-Irish Agreement, of course, had been a jolt, very much a negative factor initially, but it did weaken the integrationist wing of unionism and made those who were seeking an accommodation within Northern Ireland, made it possible for them to move forward in a different way. We did finally achieve a degree of inter-party talks in 1991. They were called the Brook Talks, followed by the talks, the Mayhew Talks, Brook and Mayhew being Secretaries of State in Northern Ireland in 1991 and 1992. And those talks demonstrated that it was possible to get an agreement, and an agreement was possible, even if not actually achieved at that time. It took a further 6 years to get the detail right, to get the pieces in place, and a further 6 years while, in the course of which we moved from to a point where the paramilitaries would go into a ceasefire and would accept the offer that was being made by other parties and by society to paramilitaries, that if they turned their back on violence in a permanent manner and showed that they were committed to exclusively peaceful and democratic means, then a process could be constructed that would enable them to participate within not just the process, but the outworking of that process. Again, as I say, it took quite a few years in terms of work, to achieve that. It was done very slowly. Maybe it could have been done more rapidly, but there are a number of factors why it took the time that it did in order to achieve that outcome by 1998. But the situation that we've been dealing with since then, both before then and since then, has been essentially one which recognises the realities of the situation in Northern Ireland, is founded on the democratic principle that consequently that the future of Northern Ireland and its constitutional destiny is something for the people of Northern Ireland alone to determine, but that because of the particular nature of society within Northern Ireland, we are making provision to put in place an administration that is inclusive and indeed other institutions that recognise a special relationship with the rest of Ireland. Those are the basic principles on which we have been proceeding. But so far as the paramilitaries are concerned, it depends upon a clear commitment by them, evidenced in practice, to exclusively peaceful and democratic means. We have, for the purpose of drawing in the extremes, been prepared to modify the normal democratic approach. When people said many years ago that they would not be prepared to speak to those who are involved in terrorism, that was a perfectly understandable position. When John Major said in the House of Commons that the thought of talking to terrorists made his stomach turn over, he was reflecting a view of very many people. But in order to try and achieve a stable and peaceful and lasting outcome in Northern Ireland, we've been prepared to move away from that understandable position, to give paramilitaries the time and the space to move away from terrorism, to come into the democratic process, and to do so on a permanent basis. But we can't extend that time and space indefinitely. I said earlier, Mr. Chairman, that I wasn't going to go through the detail of the events of the last few weeks, but lying behind the particular events of the last few weeks is that basic proposition, that people have the opportunity to come into the democratic process, but only if they leave terrorism behind, they leave violence behind, and show that they're going to proceed purely on the basis of peace and democracy. And while we've been prepared to give people time, while we've been prepared to construct special procedures to give them opportunities, while we've been prepared to do things which a year or two ago I would never have dreamed of doing, that can only be done on a temporary basis to enable people to make the response, and they do eventually have to make it. It was a number of years ago, I can't remember precisely how many, I think it was in the 1980s, that a then leading member of the Republican movement, Mr. Danny Morrison, said that when Sinn Féin was beginning to get involved in electoral politics, a matter which some members of the Republican movement regarded as being an unfortunate development, that at a Sinn Féin conference, Mr. Morrison said, "Who will object if we take power in Ireland with a ballot paper in one hand and an Armalite in the other hand?" An Armalite being a gun. That has, in a sense, has been, or appears to have been, the approach of the Republican movement from then until recently, if not still today. But it's not an approach that is tenable into the future. And if we are to make the progress that I believe that we can make in Northern Ireland, then the Armalite, the gun, has to be left behind permanently, and people have to rely purely upon the democratic process. My own view, and it's a view that I've had for several years now, is that we are coming out of the Troubles. We are coming out of the problem we've been in for the general reasons that I've mentioned, but also because of the changes that have taken place in society itself and the political developments that we've had over recent years. I believe that sooner or later this process is going to work. We've overcome quite a few obstacles in dealing with it. I think it's going to work sooner or later, one way or another, and it will work based on the principles of the agreement we all made on the 10th of April 1998. The one thing I cannot predict is precisely when all the pieces will come into place. It has taken longer than I thought it would. I knew on the 10th of April 1998 that there are still a number of issues left unresolved, that there are still problems to be dealt with. But I did not expect that it would take the guts of 2 years to work through them all. It is my hope that we can deal with the problems that we have now sooner rather than later. But what I am sure of is that we will be able to work our way through. And more than that, I'm sure too that the people of Northern Ireland deserve, not more just deserve, but also require their political representatives to work their way through it and to make the effort no matter how long it takes, in order to assure the people of Northern Ireland the sort of society they should have had and the sort of future that they do deserve. So that whatever the difficulties there may be at the moment, and I would like to leave this thought with you, do bear in mind how much progress that we have made and our determination to complete the course that we've set our hands to. Thank you.
We now have time for questions. There are microphones here on the floor and 2 also in the balcony. I'd like people to introduce themselves, give their name, their relationship to Harvard, if possible, when they speak. And I'd also like to remind you that question period is involving questions. Questions are very brief and have a question mark at the end. Or another way of putting it, there's 1 speech per evening, and Mr. Tribble has given it, and also 1 question per person, please. So let me start here.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Ivani. I'm here from Los Angeles in an executive training program, and I was, fortunate to come to this. And regarding the question of disarmament, it sort of takes a long time for adversaries to trust each other. So what would the peace process think of the idea of a phased disarmament with respect to all of the parties involved, as opposed to them just having this leap of faith, as you say, for disarmament?
I take the point you make about the situation like that, it takes quite a bit of time for people to develop trust and confidence. And to use the phrase that I'm sure you're familiar with, that's why it's so important in something like this, that there are confidence-building measures that people can undertake. And certainly, if more had been done in the last few years in terms of confidence-building measures from the paramilitaries to build confidence in the community in their intentions, then the issue would not necessarily have presented itself in the stark way that it does at the moment. We would be more than happy to operate on the basis of a phased operation. Our problem stems from the fact that nothing has happened yet. And that's the problem. If something had happened on the weapons issue, the situation would be quite different. But actually, nothing has happened. So I'd be very happy to see a phased operation of this matter. We'd be very happy to see it. I'd really look forward to the first installment.
Upper balcony on the right.
My name's Hitan Kalan, and I have no affiliation to Harvard University. Mr. Trimble, you seem to be selling us the concept here that you embrace democratic principles and would like to follow the democratic rule of where people vote. If that's the case, and so the majority of people in the North voted for the Good Friday Agreement, why is it that it took you 18 months to implement and get the structures into place? And why is it then that you seem to pander to a unionist minority and threaten to suspend the institutions, and you yourself seem to be putting roadblocks to the democratic process that a majority of people have voted for? That is the Good Friday Agreement.
Right. Let me start by saying that I voted for the agreement too, right? And I did an awful lot to actually make the agreement. So I have been quite concerned to see the agreement being implemented. Now, we had the agreement in April 1998. First thing that had to be done after April 1998 was actually to translate the agreement into legislation, right? Because there could be no question of being able to proceed with regard to putting new structures in place until we had the necessary legislation. Now, that took the best part of 9 months to get the legislation drafted and then through Parliament. We also then had to deal with a number of structural issues in terms of getting agreement with other parties on new administrative structures and new arrangements for North-South cooperation. That took until March of 1999, at which point we were then ready for devolution. But the problem is that the other things which should have been moving in parallel, the whole concept of the agreement was that there were a number of things to be done to implement it in terms of structures, in terms of prisoners, in terms of weapons decommissioning and so on. And all the other parts of the agreement were moving forward, but the decommissioning issue wasn't. And decommissioning should have begun in the summer of 1998. If the paramilitaries had carried out their part of the bargain, if they'd carried out their part of the bargain, that would have started before it was necessary, before the point for devolution would have come about. That is why, come March of last year, we then found ourselves with a difficulty. How did we approach that difficulty? We first of all had a series of inter-party talks convened. Actually, the very first thing that happened was the talks that took place in Washington on the 16th and 17th of March, which at the time I thought were extremely helpful. And we very much appreciate the time and the effort that President Clinton gave to trying to achieve progress at that time. That led straight then to a series of talks in the period running up to Easter, when the British and Irish governments brought forward what they called the Hillsborough Declaration, which Republicans rejected. So that gave us a problem then. There was another effort to solve the issue in July, at a time when the government was saying that they detected a seismic shift in the Republican position on this. Unfortunately, even with the closest examination I could make, I didn't see the seismic shift at that time. But we then went forward into a review under Senator Mitchell, George Mitchell, who came over. And that took us through from September until November. We thought at the end of November that we had a clear understanding on a way forward. We thought we had that. We talked the matter through with Republicans. We knew what their position was, we thought. They knew what our position was. And we decided at their request that we would put the institutions of government into practice in the absence of decommissioning. In the absence of decommissioning. In March of last year, Gerry Adams talked at Washington about us jumping together. I would have been delighted to jump together and for us both to move forward into both devolution and decommissioning at the same time. But in the event, I jumped first. And Mr. Adams didn't respond. And of course, before we jumped, we discussed the possibility of failure with both the British government and the Irish government. And in November, the British government clearly and publicly said that if we didn't have decommissioning within a reasonable period of time, that it would intervene. The Irish government said likewise that it would intervene and suspend. And those things were clearly in the public record in November and clearly understood by the other parties too. Nobody had any reason to feel surprised come the end of January that we had a crisis through the failure to decommission. And the statements made by Republicans, and I'm thinking here of Martin Ferris and Pat Doherty, speaking in the United States at the end of November, made it clear that they knew that the end of January was the crucial date. In the Mitchell Review and the discussions we had, it was clearly understood that 31st of January was the final cut-off date. Come the 31st of January, when no progress had occurred, yes, there were desperate efforts being made to see if some progress could be produced at the very last minute. And those efforts went on right up until the 11th of February, when they finally ran out of time. And during that time, no clear evidence of any progress by Republicans became apparent. Now, I must say, sir, speaking for myself, speaking for my party, I did everything I humanly could do to achieve progress. And I've more than a little reason to feel let down by others. But we're prepared to stick to it. But we need to see other people delivering their side of the bargain too.
Left side of the balcony.
My name is Pat Marr, and I'm with an organization called Peace Watch Ireland. And I've read the Good Friday Agreement quite closely, and I continue to be mystified by a couple of things, and I wondered if you could shed light on this. The first really is the focus on decommissioning. The Good Friday Agreement states quite clearly that a good effort must be made by political parties to try to obtain movement towards decommissioning. And there's nothing really in the Good Friday Agreement about deadlines, neither January 31st nor your recent February 12th deadline. So I'm very interested to hear really how that happened, how you've come up with a deadline such as February 12th when the existence of the Assembly itself is one of the best confidence-building measures one could have in the current situation. And also, it seems to me, looking at Northern Ireland, that the Loyalists also continue in their paramilitary organizations to have the Armalite in one hand and the ballot in another. So I'm very confused and mystified about how this decommissioning issue is leading to deadlines that lead to the dissolution of something as great as the Assembly.
I'll deal with the second point first, and I'm glad you did mention it because the IRA is bigger and has more weapons, and because Sinn Féin is electorally more significant, there's a tendency to focus on it and to forget about the Loyalist paramilitary. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because the position of the Loyalist paramilitary is just as important in this. And when we're talking about decommissioning, we're not talking about decommissioning of one group only, but we're talking about decommissioning across the board. There cannot be any room for private armies. And look, decommissioning is merely an outward gesture, it's merely a symbol of something that is actually more important than the weapons themselves, and that is whether people are committed to peace and democracy. And you cannot say that you're committed, you cannot honestly say that you're committed to peace if you keep in existence a private army armed to the teeth with the capacity of resorting to violence, because you're then retaining the option of violence for the future, even if not practicing at the time. So the very existence of the agreement and the sense running through the agreement is that there's no place in the future we're trying to construct for paramilitarism, for terrorism, and for private armies. It is therefore entirely consistent with the agreement that we move away from that and do so across the board. Now, in fact, and you can see this from the reports that General de Chaston has published, which are all accessible on the internet, so that everybody can get a hold of them that way, you'll see from them that the principal Loyalist paramilitaries, the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force, have engaged in serious discussions with the Decommissioning Commission on what we call the modalities of decommissioning. Now, the question of how it is to be done. And they've also given conditional undertakings to decommission, conditional in this, unfortunately, in the sense of saying, we'll do it if they do it. Now, we've repeatedly urged them not to be conditional and to go ahead and start first, not to wait for Republicans. There was some indication a few weeks ago that the UDA were beginning to think along those lines, and I hope that the indication wasn't borne through immediately, but I hope that that happens. I hope that that happens. As to the language in the agreement itself, when it talks about people using their best efforts to achieve decommissioning, don't attach any great significance to the use of best efforts. The idea of good faith is the whole way through it. Everybody ought to have, in what they said in the agreement, be acting in good faith. And to say that you'll use your best efforts to do something is just simply to say you'll act in good faith. So what that sentence says is that people undertake to achieve complete disarmament by the 22nd of May this year. Not to begin, but to complete it, to have it all done. Now, a completion date implies a beginning. You're right to say that the agreement is not specific as to the beginning, but it was clearly understood that everybody would begin as soon as they practicably could, and the date at which it was practically possible to begin decommissioning is when the Decommissioning Commission became fully operational in June of 1998. And certainly before the agreement was made, before the agreement was entered into on the 10th of April, it was our understanding, and the understanding of other parties too, that the period at which decommissioning should begin is from the summer of 1998 onwards.
John Fitzgerald, Groton, Massachusetts. Mr. Trimble, when first joining, members of the Orange Order make an orange promise which calls on them to oppose Catholicism in all its forms. Are you a member of the Orange Order? And if so, are you willing to resign from it because of that orange promise? And do you formally repudiate that orange promise?
What you've referred to, which appears in the qualifications of an Orangeman, you have not quoted accurately, but I'm not going to deal with the accuracy of that. Yes, I am an Orangeman. No, I have no intention of resigning. There are some people who want to throw me out of the Orange Order because I recently attended the funerals of a number of Catholics who had been murdered, and indeed the fact that I went to meet the Pope as well didn't endear me to some other people as well. The Orange Order is a fraternal organisation, and it's a fraternal organisation of Protestants, so obviously there's references to Protestantism. But there's also in the very qualifications that you've referred to, and it appears only a sentence or two afterwards, there's also an obligation on people to abstain from any uncharitable words or actions towards their fellow Roman Catholic citizens. That I have done.
My name is Alan Hassell. I live in Boston. Mr. Trimble, you spoke earlier of John Major, who stood up in Parliament and talked of his reluctance of speaking with terrorists. At the time that the Good Friday Accord was announced, it was revealed it was well known in the American press, particularly the New York Times, that you and Mr. Adams did not speak. I was wondering how your own feelings in terms of your own reluctance with speaking with terrorists, and I was wondering what your relationship at this point with Mr. Adams is. Is it thawed in any way, or are you still, is your reluctance still that strong?
Well, you're perfectly right. At the time, by the 10th of April 1998, I had not actually spoken more than a word or two to Mr. Adams. I had actually exchanged the odd word with him, not entirely voluntarily. When you're bumping into people in corridors, there's bound to be a certain amount of communication inevitably taking place.
Get out of my way.
Nothing as decisive as that. It is the case that, of course, after the agreement, not a major after the agreement, it was quite honest. I have to say to you, the first time that I found myself in the same room as people who I believed to be leading members of the provisional IRA who had a degree of personal responsibility for some appalling atrocities that had been committed over the years. I didn't find it easy, nor did I find it easy to begin with to talk with them. But one thing I will say that I did, the very first meeting we had of the Northern Ireland Assembly after it was elected, and it was the 1st of July 1998, I remember in formal comments I then made, I said that I knew that there were in this room, meaning the Assembly chamber, that there were some people in this room who've done terrible things in the past. But I said, but they don't all sit in the same corner. I wasn't just thinking purely of Republicans, I think of others as well. But I said that I come from a tradition, politically and otherwise, that views these matters that because people have a past, doesn't mean they can't have a future. We were there in that room to focus on the future. Now, dealing with Republicans in terms of talking to others has not been easy. Sometimes it's been extremely difficult. And they might even say that sometimes I've been difficult, but that's, by the way. We do communicate, although sometimes not to a great deal of purpose. And we will continue to communicate. And I hope that we will find a way of resolving this matter in accordance with what I understand to be the principles of the agreement, that we're all going to, as it were, turn over a new leaf, leave that past that's been checkered for so many of us behind, and work on building a quite different future.
Good evening. My name is Margaret Murray, and I work with the Women Waging Peace initiative with Hunt Alternatives and the Women in Public Policy program here at Harvard. I'd like to ask a question about the involvement of women at the negotiating table in Northern Ireland. Given the considerable influence that women in Northern Ireland wield at the grassroots level, and given the very limited number of women acting in an official capacity at the peace talks and during the peace process, could you please tell us what you think may be some of the barriers that women face in getting to the table, and what do you think women can do to overcome those barriers?
You're quite right to say that there's far too few women involved in politics in Northern Ireland. In fact, generally, there are far too few people involved in politics in Northern Ireland. And partly the same reason in that during the years of violence, during the years, people didn't want to get involved in a process, not just because of fear of risk, though there was a degree of risk. It wasn't just, I think, for that reason, but also the prospects in terms of actually achieving things were limited. I mean, through the 70s and the 80s and most of the 90s, it was a pretty dispiriting and pretty frustrating occupation for a lot of time. And it's quite understandable that people weren't attracted to that and sometimes find it difficult to sustain an interest in that. I very much hope that we will see more women involved in politics as something that I would greatly welcome. I know I'd love to see the appearance of my own party change for the better in that respect, and I hope we'll see some progress in that in the near future, because there's too big a resource there in terms of the ability. As you've mentioned yourself, there's too big a resource there, and we are not so well endowed in talent that we can afford to ignore the brains and the contribution that half the population can make.
Anya McCabe, and I live here in Boston, but originally from Belfast. In your address tonight, you stressed the distinction between it being an IRA delegation and not a Sinn Féin delegation involved in the talks with the British government in 1972. I'm delighted that your recognition of them as separate entities, which in fact clearly they are. And Sinn Féin being a democratically elected political party with a sizable mandate, 17% of the vote, and one of the signatories to the Good Friday Agreement, which is a compromise document. Why is it then that you and your Unionist Council felt it necessary to grandstand by handing in a post-dated resignation, which led to the suspension of the Working Assembly, thus penalising the people of the North of Ireland, when the IRA would not decommission to a Unionist-imposed deadline when they are not a signatory to the Good Friday Agreement?
The reality of the matter, which I'm sure hasn't escaped you, is that the IRA and Sinn Féin are inextricably linked. They are both part and parcel of the Republican movement. There are people involved in Sinn Féin who don't have IRA connections and activities, but they are comparatively few. The bulk of the vast majority of those who are representatives of Sinn Féin are people who are current or past members of the IRA. The Republican movement is one movement which has organised itself into two different structures, but there is still a single movement in that. What we find when we approached the issue, we came out of the Mitchell Review, and I came out of the Mitchell Review to approach the issue of persuading my party to do what many of them found to be quite distasteful, namely to put people in a government who had not decommissioned, who still had an organic relationship with a private army. What I found when I was approaching that issue is that one of the great fears that people had was that they were just going to be sucked into a situation. Now, that fear was reinforced heavily by the comments of Pat Doherty and Martin Ferris, who, speaking in engagements here in the United States, in a matter of days before our Unionist Council meeting, came out with language to the effect of, well, if we reach the end of January, and it was Doherty who said, if we reach the end of January and there hasn't been decommissioning, he says, he thinks that people will just ignore that and go on. Now, that was the fear that my colleagues had, that they would just be sucked into a situation and dragged in further and further and further. And I came to the conclusion, and I think I was right in doing so, that I would not be able to persuade the Council to move, and the Council is just simply the governing body of the party, of the delegates, of the members of the party. I would not be able to persuade them to go down this road unless I did something to put a floor underneath things, to put a floor there that gave them the assurance that the risk that they were taking would not be open-ended. I looked at ways in which of doing that which would not be time-specific. Yes, I signed a post-dated letter of resignation and gave it to Party President Joe Cunningham, but I never told anybody the date. And I put the date in February because I knew that the final cut-off date was 31 January, and I knew that Republicans knew that too. Similarly, with the resolution to meet again, all we did was we said we would meet again, and we said we'd meet again in February. And in fact, as I pointed out to Jerry Adams afterwards, that actually gave him more time. Because under our party procedures, it only takes, what is it then, a 60 or 80? 60. It only takes 60 out of 800 delegates to sign a requisition, to requisition a meeting of the Council. And our fear was that come January, come the beginning of January, that we would find a requisition coming in from people requisitioning a meeting of the council, which we, under our rules, would be compelled to hold within a couple of weeks, so that we'd then have a council meeting before the end of January. So our procedures in deciding to meet again, or just resolve to meet again in February, actually gave Republicans more time. But again, we weren't date specific. We didn't put any date out, we didn't put any deadline out. We said as little as possible about the issue. We gave the Republicans the opportunity they wanted, because we were told that they never moved under pressure. Well, when there was no pressure on them in January and December and January, they didn't move at all. And the only sign of movement that came from them was in February when they were under pressure. And there's a lesson there.
Mr. Trimble, my name is Kevin Carr, and I'm an undergraduate here at the college. My question is a simple one. You talked about the paramilitary groups having to give up their arms and enter the democratic process. Given the suspension of the assembly, do you believe that the possibilities or the probability of decommissioning taking place to be greater or lesser, and the possibility for peace to be greater or less?
Actually, I think I would come down on the positive side on both of those matters. There is no significant constituency in Northern Ireland for a return to violence. And that's true of mainstream moderate opinion, but it's also true, I think, of those sectors of society which have supported paramilitary activity in the past. That's not to say that we're immune from the threat of violence. There could still be incidents, there could still be attempts by people to return to renew a campaign. But there is no constituency for that as things stand at the moment. There is nobody, but when I say nobody, there are very, very few people who wish to see a return to violence. I said that doesn't exclude the possibility of incidents, and incidents have happened. There was even a double murder in my own district at the weekend, which may have paramilitary overtones. We're not entirely clear about that. So we're not immune from incidents occurring. But my conviction, as I said, has been that we have turned the corner in society in Northern Ireland, and that this is going to progress. It may not progress smoothly. It may not progress smoothly. It may be fits and starts, and we if you forgive the metaphor, we rolled a stone up the hill in November and December, only it hasn't settled there and it's rolled back down a bit, but it hasn't rolled the whole way back down. And when we start to try and move it further forward, we'll be moving from a position that's a little bit further forward. And sooner or later, we're going to get there, and it's going to work. Certainly, that's my conviction, and that's what I'm going to be doing.
My name's Felicity Spector, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I want to ask you really about your view on your own leadership and the pressures that you've come under. You said that Jerry Adams had said that you would both jump together, but in the event you jumped first and he didn't respond. There are those in the unionist movement who would say that you betrayed the unionist cause and who want you out, basically. How confident are you that you can resist that pressure, keep the unionist movement together? If the Assembly is reconvened, will you still be First Minister?
Technically, yes, on that point. The legislation does provide for, on resumption, that I will resume as First Minister and Seamus Mallon as Deputy First Minister. So that's why I said technically yes. Of course, the real question is what is the position within my own party? And here, I must say, I've been amazed at my own party and what it has done and what it has supported over the last couple of years. A number of the things we've asked them to do have been very difficult for them, very difficult indeed. And yes, there are people who accuse me of selling out. And I have found, yes, my home being picketed by people who are there to denounce me as a traitor and so on. But my party has, in the main, stuck with this. Now, you can see, and there are individuals who get a lot of publicity for indicating that they don't agree with party policy at a particular time or they think we're doing the wrong thing. But what I would point to is that the delegates to the council have supported this. And it is the delegates to the council who have supported this and given it a better quality of support than some of the elected representatives of the party have given. So yes, we have stuck with this. I certainly intend to stick with it. I want to see this work. I want to see this carried through to fruition. Of course, if I go to the point where the party repudiates me, I won't succeed. So obviously there are some constraints in that respect. But I have a lot of confidence in the good sense of the bulk of the party And that confidence has been justified by events so far, and I trust will be into the future as well.
We have time for one last question in the balcony.
Hello, Mr. Trimble. My name is Scott Doherty. I'm with an organization called Friends of Garvahi Road, based here in Boston. And my question goes back to the Orange Order and your membership in it. I'm sure you're aware of the Irish Nationalist Catholic view of the Orange Order, and certainly major media makers in the United States have compared it to the KKK. My question is, how, as First Minister, can you, recognizing the harm and the fear that members of the Irish Nationalist people have, continue to remain a member of the Orange Order and in fact represent them? It just seems incongruous with building trust between the communities.
Well, I'm happy to say that's not the attitude of most nationalists in Northern Ireland.
Let me thank you all for your attentiveness this evening, and particularly thank David Trimble for his presentation to us on an extremely difficult problem. We hope that we will be able to welcome him back someday when there indeed will have been a full conclusion of the peace process in Northern Ireland. In the meantime, we thank him for being with us tonight. We're going to walk out here on the left side. That was very good.
Political thing? I know, but there is, it's not an exact equivalence, but am I right in thinking Catholics tend to support the reunification? No, you're not right. I live in Northern Ireland, okay. So if my ex-boyfriend's from the Falls Road, which is sort of like IRA strongholds, Sinn Féin headquarters, etc. He doesn't support Sinn Féin, and he wouldn't, you know. I was just well, I suppose on average, maybe, but... I'm not saying it's an exact equivalence. I'm just thinking that if I were a unionist or a Sinn Féin leader, and I were thinking, what's going to happen in the long run? And if I knew that the British had said that when a majority of the people of Northern Ireland vote that they wanted to unify with Ireland,